Hello and welcome to History at Night. Picture this. You're standing in a vast jungle clearing in Cambodia, surrounded by towering trees that stretch endlessly in every direction. The air is thick with humidity and alive with the calls of exotic birds. But as you look closer, something extraordinary emerges from the green chaos around you. Massive stone faces peer down at you through centuries of vines and moss. Intricate carvings cover walls that stretch higher than cathedral spires. Ancient causeways disappear into the forest like forgotten highways to nowhere. You're standing in the ruins of what was once the largest urban settlement in the pre-industrial world. This is Angkor, and it holds one of history's most fascinating mysteries. At its peak in the 12th century, this incredible civilization covered an area larger than modern New York City. Over 1 million people called this place home. They built temples that defied imagination, engineered water systems more sophisticated than anything in medieval Europe, and created art so beautiful it still takes your breath away today. And then, seemingly without warning, they simply walked away. The greatest city on earth became a ghost town, slowly consumed by the relentless jungle that had once been held at bay. Tonight we will journey deep into this lost world to uncover what really happened at Angkor. We will explore the rise of the mighty Khmer Empire, witness the incredible engineering feats that made their civilization possible, and then follow the clues that reveal why it all came crashing down. This is not just a story of abandoned temples and forgotten kings. It is a tale of environmental disaster, political upheaval, and the delicate balance between human ambition and the natural world. But before we begin our journey into the heart of this ancient mystery, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history's greatest puzzles. I'm also curious to know where in the world you're listening tonight, so please share that in the comments below. Now, settle in and let the modern world fade away. We're about to step back nearly 1,000 years to explore one of the most spectacular civilizations ever built, and discover why even the mightiest empires can vanish into the mist of time. Our story begins not with the great temples that tourists flock to see today, but with something far more fundamental. Water. The secret to understanding Angkor lies not in its magnificent stone monuments, but in the invisibles, reserve network of canals and waterways that made life possible in this corner of Southeast Asia. Long before the first temple stone was carved, the ancestors of the Khmer people were already masters of water management in one of the world's most challenging environments. Cambodia sits in a region where nature operates on extremes. For half the year, monsoon rains pound the landscape with such intensity that vast areas become completely flooded lakes. Rivers swell to many times their normal size, and the very geography of the land seems to shift as water spreads across rice paddies and forests alike. Then, as if someone has turned off a cosmic faucet, the rains stop. The other half of the year brings a bone-dry season, where the blazing sun beats down mercilessly. Rivers shrink to mere trickles, and the same land that was underwater months before becomes parched and cracked. For most civilizations, such extreme conditions would be a barrier to growth. But the early Khmer saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. They understood that whoever could master this cycle of flood and drought would hold the key to incredible wealth and power. Rice, the foundation of all Southeast Asian civilizations, thrived in flooded fields during the wet season. But it needed carefully controlled water levels, not the chaotic flooding that nature provided. The solution was to build a system so vast and sophisticated that it could capture the monsoon rains, store them in enormous reservoirs, and then distribute that water precisely when and where it was needed during the dry months. This was the birth of hydraulic civilization in Southeast Asia. Starting in the early centuries of the first millennium, Khmer engineers began constructing what would eventually become the most advanced water management system in the medieval world. They dug canals that stretched for hundreds of miles, connecting distant rivers and creating artificial waterways where none had existed before. They built massive earth control flooding and dikes to direct water flow. Most impressively of all, they created enormous rectangular reservoirs called barrays that could store millions of gallons of precious water. These barrays were not simple ponds. They were engineering marvels that required moving millions of tons of earth using nothing but human labour and simple tools. The largest, called the West Barray, covered an area of more than 6 square miles and could hold enough water to supply a major modern city. When you consider that this was built over 900 years ago using only shovels, baskets, and human muscle, the scale of the achievement becomes truly staggering. But water management was only the beginning. The Khmer understood that controlling water meant controlling agriculture, and controlling agriculture meant controlling people. As their irrigation systems expanded, so did their ability to support larger and larger populations. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and eventually, one city grew to become the centre of an empire that would dominate Southeast Asia for centuries. The man who would transform this growing civilization into a true empire was born around 1113 AD with the name Suryavarman, but history would remember him as Suryavarman VII, the greatest king the Khmer Empire would ever produce. When he seized power in 1181, he inherited a kingdom that was already impressive by any medieval standard. But Suryavarman had a vision that went far beyond what any of his predecessors had imagined. He would build not just a capital city, but a terrestrial representation of the Hindu cosmos itself. In Hindu cosmology, the universe is centered around Mount Meru, a sacred mountain that serves as the axis connecting the earthly realm with the heavens above. Suryavarman decided to recreate this cosmic mountain in stone, along with the entire sacred geography that surrounded it. The result would be Angkor Wat, a city unlike anything the world had ever seen. The construction of Angkor Wat required resources on a scale that boggled the imagination. Thousands of elephants were employed to haul massive stone blocks from quarries located many miles away. Tens of thousands of workers laboured for decades to carve intricate reliefs, construct soaring towers, and create the complex network of temples, palaces, and public buildings that filled the city. The central temple complex alone, known today as the Bayon, featured over 200 massive stone faces, each one carved with the serene expression of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, gazing out in the 4 cardinal directions with eyes that seemed to see everything. But even the magnificent Angkor Wat was not Suryavarman's greatest achievement. That honour belongs to the temple complex that has become synonymous with Khmer civilization itself. Angkor Wat, built earlier in the 12th century during the reign of Suryavarman, the 7th's predecessor, represents the absolute pinnacle of Khmer architectural achievement. This single temple complex covers more than 400 acres and contains more stone than all the pyramids of Egypt combined. Its central tower rises over 200 feet into the sky, visible from miles away across the flat Cambodian landscape. The precision of Angkor Wat's construction defies belief. The temple is perfectly aligned with astronomical phenomena, its layout corresponding to the cycles of Hindu cosmology with mathematical exactness. The famous bas-reliefs that cover the temple walls stretch for nearly half a mile and depict scenes from Hindu epics with a level of artistic sophistication that rivals the greatest works of classical Greece or Renaissance Italy. Every stone was cut to fit perfectly with its neighbours, creating walls so smooth and precise that you cannot slide a knife blade between the blocks even today, nearly 900 years after construction. Yet for all its artistic and architectural magnificence, Angkor Wat was built to serve a very practical purpose. It was the state temple of the Khmer Empire, the physical manifestation of the divine authority that legitimized the king's rule over his subjects. In the Hindu-influenced political system of the Khmer, the king was not merely a political leader, but a god-king, a divine being whose authority came directly from the Hindu pantheon. The temple served as his earthly palace and his eternal tomb, a place where the boundary between the human and divine realms dissolved entirely. This fusion of political power with religious authority was the secret to the Khmer Empire's remarkable stability and longevity. For over 6 centuries, a succession of god-kings ruled from Angkor, each one adding to the city's grandeur, with new temples, new reservoirs, and new monuments to their own divine status. The empire expanded to control much of what is now Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. Trade networks stretched across the South China Sea, bringing wealth from as far away as China and India into the royal treasuries of Angkor. At its peak in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Angkor was quite possibly the largest urban area in the world. Recent archaeological surveys using advanced satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have revealed that the city covered over 400 square miles, making it significantly larger than any contemporary European city. The population likely exceeded 1 million people, supported by the most sophisticated agricultural system in Southeast Asia and sustained by tribute from vassal states across the region. The daily life of this great city was a marvel of organization and complexity. The central temple complexes were surrounded by vast residential areas where nobles, merchants, artisans, and common people lived in houses built on stilts to protect against seasonal flooding. Markets bustled with traders offering goods from across Asia. The sounds of construction echoed constantly as new temples rose to honor the latest royal achievements. Canals filled with boats, carrying rice from distant provinces, stone from remote quarries, and luxury goods from foreign lands. But beneath this surface prosperity, the very foundations of Khmer civilization were beginning to show signs of strain. The same hydraulic system that had made Angkor possible was becoming a victim of its own success. As the city grew larger and more complex, it demanded ever greater quantities of water for drinking, agriculture, and the elaborate ritual baths that were central to Hindu religious practice. The network of canals and reservoirs had to be constantly expanded and maintained, requiring enormous amounts of human labor and resources. Even more challenging was the environmental impact of supporting such a massive population in a tropical setting. The forests around Angkor were gradually cleared to make room for rice paddies, residential areas, and the enormous quantities of wood needed for construction and fuel. This deforestation began to alter the local climate patterns that the entire water management system depended upon. Without forest cover to moderate temperature and humidity, the seasonal rains became less predictable. Without tree roots to hold soil in place, erosion began to clog the carefully engineered canal system. The political structure of the empire was also evolving in ways that would prove problematic. As Angkor grew in size and complexity, the god-kings became increasingly isolated from their subjects, surrounded by elaborate court rituals and massive bureaucracies. The empire had grown so large that effective central control became nearly impossible using medieval communication and transportation methods. Provincial governors began to act with increasing independence, keeping larger shares of local tax revenues for themselves and providing less support to the central government in Angkor. Meanwhile, the very success of the Khmer Empire was attracting dangerous attention from beyond its borders. To the east, the kingdom of Champa had been locked in intermittent warfare with the Khmer for generations, fighting over control of lucrative trade routes and fertile agricultural lands. These conflicts had traditionally been manageable for the powerful Khmer military, but they were becoming increasingly costly and disruptive. Each war required enormous resources to fund armies, rebuild damaged infrastructure, and maintain control over contested territories. Even more ominously, a new power was rising in the north that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Southeast Asia. The Thai kingdoms, originally centered in what is now southern China, had been gradually migrating southward under pressure from Mongol expansion. These Thai peoples were skilled warriors and experienced administrators who had learned much from their conflicts with Chinese forces. Unlike the traditional enemies of the Khmer, the Thai brought with them new military technologies, different political systems, and most importantly, a unified sense of purpose that the increasingly fragmented Khmer Empire was beginning to lack. The first major Thai kingdom to pose a serious threat to Khmer hegemony was Sukhothai, established in the mid-13th century. But it was the later kingdom of Ayutthaya, founded in 1351, that would prove to be the death knell of Angkor's dominance. The Ayutthaya kingdom was strategically positioned to control the Chao Phraya River Valley, one of the most fertile and economically important regions in Southeast Asia. From this base, the Thai rulers could threaten Khmer trade routes, raid Khmer territories, and gradually chip away at the empire's northwestern provinces. What made the Thai threat so dangerous was not just their military prowess, but their adoption of Theravada Buddhism as their state religion. This created a fundamental ideological challenge to the Hindu-based divine kingship that had legitimized Khmer rule for centuries. Theravada Buddhism, with its emphasis on individual spiritual development and its rejection of elaborate ritual hierarchies, offered an appealing alternative to the increasingly expensive and complex religious ceremonies that dominated life in Angkor. The spread of Theravada Buddhism throughout the Khmer Empire created a crisis of legitimacy that went to the very heart of the political system. If the king was not truly a god-king blessed by Hindu deities, then what justified his absolute authority? If the elaborate temple complexes were not necessary for cosmic harmony, then why should peasants continue to provide the enormous labour and resources needed to maintain them? These questions began to circulate throughout Khmer society, undermining the ideological foundations that had held the empire together for so many centuries. At the same time, the practical challenges of maintaining Angkor's water management system were becoming increasingly severe. The network of canals, reservoirs, and dikes that had made the city possible required constant maintenance and periodic major reconstruction. Silt from deforested watersheds was clogging water at an alarming rate. The elaborate Wei's system of locks and gates that controlled water flow was breaking down faster than it could be repaired. Seasonal flooding was becoming more unpredictable and more destructive, while droughts were lasting longer and affecting larger areas. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the 14th century, parts of the water management system were being abandoned entirely. Some of the smaller reservoirs were allowed to fill with sediment and vegetation. Certain canal networks were no longer being dredged or maintained. This was not necessarily a sign of immediate crisis, but rather an indication that the Khmer were making difficult choices about where to allocate their diminishing resources. The economic foundations of the empire were also shifting in ways that undermined Angkor's importance. For centuries, the city had served as the crucial link between the maritime trade networks of the South China Sea and the overland routes that connected Southeast Asia with India and the Middle East. But by the 14th century, improvements in shipbuilding and navigation were making it possible for merchants to bypass the traditional river routes entirely. Chinese and Arab traders could now sail directly to ports on the Malay Peninsula or the Indonesian archipelago, avoiding the taxes and regulations imposed by Khmer authorities. This shift in trade patterns had profound implications for the royal treasury. Much of the wealth that had funded Angkor's construction projects and military campaigns had come from taxes on trade goods passing through Khmer territory. As merchants found alternative routes, this revenue stream began to dry up. The kings of Angkor found themselves with less money to maintain their water systems, less resources to fund their armies, and fewer luxury goods to reward the loyalty of provincial governors and court officials. The social fabric of Khmer society was also beginning to fray under these multiple pressures. The massive construction projects that had employed hundreds of thousands of workers for generations were being scaled back or abandoned entirely. Skilled artisans who had carved the intricate reliefs of Angkor Wat found themselves without work. The complex hierarchy of priests, officials, and servants who had maintained the elaborate court ceremonies began to seem increasingly irrelevant to ordinary people struggling with failed harvests and increased taxation. Perhaps most tellingly, the royal chronicles that had carefully recorded the achievements and divine status of each successive king began to show signs of uncertainty and defensiveness. Where earlier inscriptions had confidently proclaimed the eternal glory of Khmer civilization, later texts focused increasingly on defensive measures against external enemies and internal rebellions. The tone shifted from celebration to anxiety, from expansion to consolidation, from confidence to desperation. Yet even as these problems mounted, the basic structure of life in Angkor continued much as it had for centuries. Farmers still planted rice in the flooded fields during monsoon season. Craftsmen still carved stone reliefs for temple walls, though perhaps with less frequency and on a smaller scale. Merchants still traded goods in the city's markets, though the variety and quantity of foreign luxuries was diminishing. The great festivals and religious ceremonies still took place, though they required increasing effort to organize and fund. This gradual decline was almost imperceptible to those living through it. Each year brought familiar challenges that had been faced and overcome before. Each season followed the ancient rhythms of flood and drought that had shaped Khmer civilization from its beginnings. The idea that this great city, this center of divine power and earthly wealth, could simply be abandoned would have seemed unthinkable to most of its inhabitants. But history has a way of accelerating when multiple crises converge. The same hydraulic system that had made Angkor the greatest city in Southeast Asia was about to face a challenge unlike anything in its 600-year history. Climate records preserved in tree rings and lake sediments reveal that the late 14th and early 15th centuries brought weather patterns of unprecedented severity to the region. What the Khmer could not have known was that they were about to face the ultimate test of their civilization's resilience. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic urban collapses. All the elements were in place: environmental stress, political fragmentation, economic decline, military pressure, and ideological crisis. But the final blow would come from an enemy that no human engineering could defeat, no army could fight, and no god-king could command. It would come from the sky itself, in the form of droughts and floods so severe that they would break the ancient covenant between the Khmer people and the water that had given them life. The first signs of the catastrophe that would doom Angkor appeared not as dramatic disasters, but as subtle shifts in patterns that had remained constant for generations. Tree ring data from across Southeast Asia tells us that beginning around 1350, the region entered a period of climate instability unlike anything experienced in recorded history. The monsoons that had arrived with clockwork regularity for centuries began to falter. Some years brought too little rain, leaving the great reservoirs only partially filled and forcing farmers to watch their rice crops wither in the fields. Other years brought devastating deluges that overwhelmed the carefully engineered canal systems and washed away entire villages. For a civilization built entirely around the predictable rhythm of wet and dry seasons, this climate chaos was nothing short of apocalyptic. The Khmer had spent 600 years perfecting a water management system designed for specific conditions. Their reservoirs were sized to capture the expected amount of monsoon rainfall. Their canals were engineered to handle normal seasonal flooding. Their agricultural calendar was synchronized with weather-had-piers patterns that isted for millennia. When those patterns suddenly became unreliable, the entire foundation of Khmer society began to crumble. The great bares that had been symbols of royal power and engineering genius became symbols of failure instead. During drought years, these massive reservoirs turned into vast mudflats, their stone-lined bottoms exposed to the merciless sun. The sight of empty bares was more than just an inconvenience for farmers needing irrigation water. It was a visible sign that the god-kings had lost their divine mandate to control the natural world. How could a ruler claim to be blessed by the gods when he could not even fill his own reservoirs? Worse still were the flood years, when monsoons arrived with unprecedented intensity. The same reservoirs and canals that had been designed to manage normal seasonal flooding became death traps when faced with truly extreme weather. Water rushed through the city with devastating force, undermining temple foundations, destroying residential areas, and carrying away centuries of accumulated wealth. The hydraulic system that had made Angkor possible was now actively destroying it. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the desperate measures taken by Khmer engineers adapt their ancient systems to these new realities. Hasty modifications were made to canal networks, with new channels carved to redirect floodwaters and emergency spillways constructed to protect critical infrastructure. But these improvised solutions could not address the fundamental problem. The climate itself had changed, and no amount of human engineering could force it back into its old patterns. The social consequences of this environmental crisis were immediate and severe. Rice harvests became increasingly unpredictable, leading to widespread hunger and social unrest. The elaborate court ceremonies that had validated royal authority became impossible to maintain when resources were needed for basic survival. Provincial governors found themselves dealing with local crises that left them little time or inclination to support the central government in Angkor. Perhaps most damaging of all was the psychological impact on ordinary people. For generations, the Khmer had been told that their kings possessed divine powers that could ensure prosperity and stability. The magnificent temples of Angkor were physical proof of this divine connection. But when the rains failed year after year, or when floods destroyed everything in their path, people began to question whether their rulers truly had the gods' blessing. This crisis of faith was exploited by Buddhist monks who had been quietly gaining influence throughout the empire. Unlike the Hindu priesthood that supported the god-king system, these Buddhist teachers preached that suffering was an inevitable part of existence and that salvation came through individual spiritual development rather than royal intervention. Their message resonated powerfully with people who had watched their traditional leaders fail to protect them from natural disasters. The spread of Theravada Buddhism represented more than just a religious conversion. It was a fundamental rejection of the political and social system that had defined Khmer civilization for centuries. If the king was not truly divine, then his authority was based on nothing more than military force and tradition. If elaborate temple ceremonies could not guarantee good harvests, then why should people continue to support the enormous expense of maintaining them? Meanwhile, the Thai kingdoms to the west were growing stronger and more aggressive with each passing year. The rulers of Ayutthaya had been carefully watching the troubles in Angkor, waiting for the right moment to strike. They understood that the Khmer Empire was weakening from within, torn apart by environmental disasters, economic decline, and religious upheaval. The great military machine that had once dominated Southeast Asia was increasingly focused on internal problems rather than external defense. The first major Thai assault on Khmer territory came in 1353, just as Angkor was struggling with one of the worst droughts in memory. Thai armies swept across the empire's northwestern provinces, meeting little organized resistance from Khmer forces that were dispersed across the kingdom, trying to maintain order. What should have been a minor border raid turned into a devastating invasion that reached the outskirts of Angkor itself. The psychological impact of this military defeat was perhaps even more damaging than the physical destruction. For the first time in centuries, foreign armies had penetrated to the very heart of the Khmer Empire. The walls of Angkor, which had never been tested by serious attack, were suddenly revealed to be inadequate against determined enemies equipped with new weapons and tactics. The aura of invincibility that had protected the god kings was shattered in a matter of months. The Thai withdrawal after this initial attack was almost as significant as the invasion itself. Rather than attempting to occupy and hold Khmer territory, the Thai armies pulled back after devastating the countryside and carrying off enormous quantities of plunder. This pattern would be repeated again and again over the following decades. The Thai had learned that they did not need to conquer Angkor permanently. They could simply raid it repeatedly, each time weakening the empire's ability to resist future attacks. These raids had a cumulative effect that went immediate military impact. Each Thai incursion disrupted trade networks, destroyed agricultural infrastructure, and forced the Khmer to divert resources from maintenance and construction to military defense. The great building projects that had employed thousands of workers ground to a halt. The elaborate water management system received less and less attention as engineers and labourers were pressed into military service. Even more damaging was the impact on the empire's tributary relationships. Provincial governors and vassal kings throughout the region watched as Angkor proved unable to protect them from Thai raids. Many began to question whether their loyalty to the Khmer Empire was worth maintaining. Some switched sides entirely, allying themselves with the Thai kingdoms that seemed to offer better protection and more opportunities for advancement. The royal court in Angkor responded to these mounting crises with increasingly desperate measures. New taxes were imposed to fund military campaigns and infrastructure repairs. Forced labour was expanded to rebuild damaged canal systems and construct fortifications. Religious ceremonies became kings as more elaborate and expensive tried to demonstrate their continued divine favour. But each of these responses only made the underlying problems worse. Higher taxes drove more provincial leaders toward rebellion or defection. Expanded forced labour took farmers away from their fields during critical planting and harvest seasons. Expensive religious ceremonies consumed resources that were desperately needed for practical purposes. The cure was becoming worse than the disease, accelerating the very decline it was meant to address. By the early 15th century, Angkor had entered a death spiral from which there seemed to be no escape. The city that had once housed over 1 million people was visibly shrinking as families abandoned their homes and migrated to regions that offered better prospects for survival. Entire residential districts were gradually reclaimed by jungle vegetation. Some of the smaller temple complexes were stripped of valuable materials and left to decay. The great reservoirs that had once been symbols of Khmer engineering prowess were filling with silt and vegetation. Without constant maintenance, the elaborate system of dikes and channels that controlled water flow was breaking down section by section. Parts of the city that had been protected from seasonal flooding for centuries found themselves underwater during the monsoon months. Other areas that had relied on canal-fed irrigation were left high and dry when water levels dropped. Trade networks that had connected Angkor to markets across Asia were collapsing as merchants found safer and more profitable routes. The skilled craftsmen who had created the magnificent sculptures and reliefs of the temples were floor-grating to other kingdoms that could still afford to pay for their work. The complex administrative system that had governed the empire for centuries was fragmenting as local officials stopped sending reports and tribute to the central government. Yet even in this period of obvious decline, the basic rhythms of life in Angkor continued. Farmers still planted rice in whatever fields remained productive. Merchants still gathered in the city's markets, though they had far fewer goods to trade. Priests still performed ceremonies in the temples, though the congregations grew smaller each year. The momentum of 6 centuries of civilization could not be stopped overnight, even when its foundations were crumbling. The final blow would come not from any human enemy, but from nature itself. Climate records that the Perio indicated from 1400 to 1430 brought some of the most extreme weather conditions in Southeast Asian history. Droughts of unprecedented severity alternated with floods of devastating intensity. The monsoon patterns that had sustained Khmer civilization since its beginnings became completely unreliable. Crops failed year after year, leading to widespread famine and social collapse. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the desperate final attempts to keep Angkor functioning. emergency modifications were made to the water management system, with new channels hastily dug to redirect what little water was available. Some of the great stone temples were partially dismantled to provide materials for more practical construction projects. Even the royal palace complex shows signs of hasty repairs and improvised modifications. But by this point, the damage was irreversible. The hydraulic civilization that had made Angkor possible had been broken beyond repair. The political system that had held the empire together had lost all legitimacy. The economic networks that had funded the city's grandeur had collapsed entirely. Most importantly, the people themselves had lost faith in the system that had defined their lives for generations. The abandonment of Angkor was not a single dramatic event, but a gradual process that unfolded over several decades. Families left quietly, taking whatever portable possessions they could carry and seeking new homes in more promising locations. Government officials stopped coming to work as there was no longer any government to serve. Temple priests performed their final ceremonies and then departed for monasteries in distant kingdoms. By 1440, the greatest city in medieval Southeast Asia had become a ghost town. The magnificent temples still stood, their carved faces staring out over empty plazas and overgrown gardens. The great reservoirs still held water during good monsoon years, but there was no one left to maintain the canal systems that had once distributed it throughout the city. The jungle, held at bay for 6 centuries by human effort and ingenuity, began its patient work of reclamation. The last inscriptions carved in Angkor's temples speak of confusion and desperation. Gone are the confident proclamations of divine authority and eternal glory that had characterized earlier royal monuments. Instead, these final messages plead with the gods for mercy, beg for the return of better times, and express bewilderment at how such a mighty civilization could have fallen so far so fast. They are the death songs of a dying empire, carved in stone by people who could not quite believe what was happening to their world. The exodus from Angkor was not uniform across all segments of society. Archaeological evidence reveals that different social classes abandoned the city at different rates and for different reasons. The wealthy merchant families were among the first to leave, taking their portable wealth and business networks to more promising locations. These families had the resources to relocate and the international connections to establish themselves in other commercial centres across Southeast Asia. The skilled artisans followed soon after. Stone carvers, bronze workers, silk weavers, and other craftspeople found that demand for their services was drying up as the royal court could no longer afford elaborate projects. Many of these artisans migrated to the Thai kingdoms, where their expertise was welcomed and well compensated. Others travelled to the emerging ports along the Malay Peninsula, where growing maritime trade created new opportunities for skilled workers. The administrative class presented a more complex pattern. Some government officials attempted to maintain their positions even as the system crumbled around them, clinging to titles and ceremonies that had lost all practical meaning. Others recognized the futility of their situation and sought positions in the bureaucracies of rival kingdoms. A few attempted to establish themselves as independent local rulers in remote provinces, though most of these efforts ended in failure. The common people faced the most difficult choices. Unlike the wealthy and skilled, they lacked the resources for long-distance migration and the specialized knowledge that might guarantee them welcome elsewhere. Many became internal refugees, moving from one part of the empire to another in search of productive farmland and stable governance. Others joined the growing bands of displaced persons that roamed the countryside, sometimes turning to banditry when other options failed. The religious community experienced its own form of dissolution. Hindu priests who had served the elaborate temple ceremonies found themselves without congregations or royal patronage. Some attempted to maintain traditional rituals with whatever resources they could gather, performing simplified versions ceremonies for the of ancient few remaining devotees. Others converted to Buddhism, joining the growing number of Theravada monasteries that were spreading throughout the region. Buddhist monks, by contrast, often thrived during this period of upheaval. Their message of accepting suffering and seeking individual spiritual development resonated with people whose traditional sources of security had vanished. Many abandoned villages became sites for new Buddhist monasteries, as monks moved into empty buildings and established meditation centers in the ruins of Hindu temples. The physical transformation of Angkor during these final decades was as dramatic as its social changes. Buildings that had been maintained for centuries began to show signs of serious deterioration. Roofs leaked during the monsoon season, allowing water to damage interior artwork and structural elements. Stone carvings became weathered and illegible as protective overhangs collapsed. The elaborate gardens that had surrounded the palace complexes grew wild and unkempt. The great causeways that had connected different parts of the city became impassable as bridges collapsed and roadways were washed out by seasonal flooding. The sophisticated drainage systems that had kept the urban core dry during monsoon season failed as channels became clogged with debris and entire neighborhoods found vegetation themselves underwater for months at a time, forcing the remaining residents to abandon their homes. Wildlife began to reclaim territories that had been exclusively human for centuries. Monkeys moved into abandoned buildings, using temple chambers as shelter and raising families in rooms that had once housed sacred statues. Wild pigs rooted through the ruins of residential areas, searching for food among the debris of human habitation. Birds nested in the carved faces of temple towers, their droppings slowly eroding the intricate stonework that had taken decades to complete. The forest itself seemed to sense the opportunity presented by human retreat. Vines crept up temple walls with increasing boldness, their roots working into cracks between stones and gradually prying apart structures that had seemed permanent. Trees sprouted from the corners of buildings where seeds had found purchase in accumulated debris. What had once been a carefully controlled urban landscape began its transformation back into the jungle that had existed before human intervention. Yet even in abandonment, Angkor retained a ghostly vitality. Pilgrims continued to visit some of the more accessible temples, maintaining a connection between the living world and the ruins of the past. Local villagers living in the surrounding area developed new relationships with the empty city, using abandoned buildings as shelter during storms and quarrying stone from ruined structures for their own construction projects. Some of the great temples never completely lost their religious significance. Buddhist monks established small monasteries in corners of Hindu temple complexes, adapting ancient buildings to serve new spiritual purposes. These monastic communities maintained basic upkeep of their immediate surroundings, preventing complete decay while allowing the larger complex to gradually return to nature. The economic networks that had once centered on Angkor underwent their own transformation. Trade routes shifted to avoid the increasingly dangerous and unprofitable journey through abandoned territories. Merchants who had once brought luxury goods to the royal court redirected their efforts toward the growing ports of southern Thailand and the Malay Peninsula. The flow of wealth that had sustained Angkor's grandeur was diverted to new centres of power and prosperity. Local markets that had served the urban population dwindled and disappeared as the customer base evaporated. Specialised craftspeople who had produced goods for city dwellers found themselves without buyers for their products. The complex division of labour that had made urban life possible collapsed back into the simpler patterns of rural subsistence agriculture. Agricultural systems around Angkor faced their own challenges during this period of abandonment. The elaborate irrigation networks that had supported intensive rice cultivation required constant maintenance that was no longer available. Canals filled with silt and vegetation, reducing their capacity to deliver water during dry seasons. dikes and levees that had controlled flooding broke down, subjecting farmland to unpredictable inundation. Some farming communities attempted to maintain portions of the water management system on a smaller scale, focusing their limited labour on the most essential channels and reservoirs. These efforts met with mixed success, as the interconnected nature of the original system meant that failure in one area often compromised the effectiveness of all connected components. The transformation of agricultural land use patterns had profound ecological consequences. Intensive rice cultivation was gradually replaced by less productive but more sustainable farming methods that required less water management and maintenance. Forest began to reclaim abandoned agricultural areas, creating a patchwork landscape of recovering woodland, active farmland, and deteriorating infrastructure. Wildlife populations that had been suppressed or displaced by centuries of intensive human activity began to recover. Elephants returned to areas where they had not been seen for generations, though they often came into conflict with the remaining human settlements. Large predators like tigers and leopards expanded their territories into regions that had previously been too populated to support them. The social memory of Angkor's greatness proved remarkably persistent, even as the physical city crumbled. Local communities preserved oral traditions that remembered the time when gods walked among men and great kings commanded the waters themselves. These stories often merged historical facts with mythological elements, creating a complex folk memory that both preserved and transformed the reality of Khmer civilization. Some families maintained genealogical traditions, claiming descent from the royal court or the priestly classes of ancient Angkor. These claims, whether accurate or not, provided a sense of connection to the glorious past and helped preserve cultural practices that might otherwise have been lost. Traditional ceremonies, architectural techniques, and artistic styles survived in simplified forms among rural communities long after the urban centres that had perfected them had vanished. The linguistic legacy of the Khmer Empire also persisted in scattered communities throughout the region. The Khmer language continued to be spoken in villages that had once been part of the empire's periphery, even as political control shifted to Thai or Vietnamese rulers. Ancient scripts were preserved in monastery libraries, maintaining literacy traditions that would prove crucial for later cultural revival movements. Religious syncretism became a common feature of the post-Angkor period, as communities blended Hindu, Buddhist, and indigenous spiritual traditions into new forms of worship. Ancient Hindu deities were reinterpreted as Buddhist protective spirits, while traditional ancestor worship was incorporated into Buddhist meditation practices. This religious flexibility allowed communities to maintain spiritual continuity even as their political and economic circumstances changed dramatically. The technological knowledge that had made Angkor's hydraulic civilization possible did not disappear entirely with the city's abandonment. Scattered communities of engineers and craftspeople preserved specialized skills in stone carving, canal construction, and water management. This knowledge would occasionally surface in later construction projects, though never again on the scale that had characterized the height of Khmer power. Trade networks, while disrupted by Angkor's collapse, eventually reformed around new centers of gravity. The Thai kingdoms that had contributed to the empire's downfall became the inheritors of many of its commercial relationships, redirecting trade flows toward their own growing cities. Chinese and Arab merchants who had once dealt with Khmer officials found new partners among Thai, Malay, and Javanese rulers. The environmental recovery of the Angkor region proceeded at different rates in different areas. Some parts of the former urban complex returned to forest cover within decades, while others retained visible signs of human modification for centuries. The great reservoirs, being artificial features that required no maintenance once filled, continued to function as water sources for local communities and wildlife long after their original purpose had been forgotten. Archaeological deposits from this period reveal a landscape in transition, with layers of abandonment debris mixed with evidence of continued low-level human activity. Scattered pottery sherds indicate that some areas remained inhabited by small populations who made use of the ruins for practical purposes while lacking the resources or organization to maintain them properly. The story of Angkor's abandonment raises profound questions about the sustainability of human civilizations and their relationship with environmental systems. The Khmer had created one of the most sophisticated urban environments in the pre-industrial world, supporting a population density that would not be matched in the region until the modern era. Yet this achievement proved fragile when faced with climatic changes that exceeded the system's capacity to adapt. The collapse also demonstrates how quickly complex social and political systems can unravel when their fundamental assumptions are challenged. The God-King system that had provided stability and legitimacy for centuries became a liability when rulers proved unable to fulfill their basic promise of ensuring prosperity and security. Alternative ideologies that had long existed on the margins of society suddenly became attractive to populations seeking new sources of meaning and authority. Modern climate science has confirmed that the period of Angkor's final decline coincided with some of the most severe weather anomalies in Southeast Asian recorded history. The medieval climate anomaly, which brought unusual weather patterns to many parts of the world, appears to have hit the Angkor region with particular severity. Tree ring data and lake sediment cores reveal patterns of drought and flooding that would have overwhelmed any water management system designed for more stable conditions. The lesson of Angkor is not simply one of environmental determinism, however. Many other civilizations have survived severe climatic challenges by adapting their social and economic systems to new realities. The Khmer Empire's inability to make such adaptations reflects the rigidity of its political and religious structures, as much as the severity of the environmental pressures it faced. The irony of Angkor's fate lies in the very perfection of its original design. The hydraulic system that made the city possible was so finely tuned to specific environmental conditions that it lacked the flexibility to handle significant variations. The political system was so dependent on the successful functioning of that hydraulic system that it could not survive when water management failed. The religious ideology that legitimized the entire structure was so closely tied to the king's ability to control natural forces that it collapsed when those forces proved uncontrollable. In this sense, Angkor's collapse represents not just the end of a particular civilization, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-specialization and inflexibility in human societies. The very factors that had made the Khmer Empire great became the sources of its vulnerability when circumstances changed beyond the range of its adaptive capacity. The final decades of Angkor's existence were marked by a gradual but inexorable process of institutional collapse that extended far beyond the mere abandonment of buildings. The elaborate administrative machinery that had governed an empire spanning much of Southeast Asia began to break down in ways that revealed just how interconnected and fragile the entire system had become. Court records from this period, fragmented though they are, paint a picture of a government increasingly unable to perform even its most basic functions. The royal treasury, once filled with tribute from dozens of vassal states and taxes from thriving trade networks, found itself chronically empty. The expensive ceremonies that had validated royal authority became impossible to fund properly, leading to simplified rituals that seemed to diminish rather than enhance the king's divine status. Palace maintenance was deferred year after year until the very symbol of royal power began to show visible signs of decay. Perhaps most telling was the breakdown system that had connected the Curiad Angkor to its far-flung provinces. For centuries, royal messengers had carried orders, reports, and tribute along well-maintained roads that stretched across the empire. But as resources dwindled and security deteriorated, these communication networks began to fail. Provincial governors stopped receiving regular instructions from the capital, and the central government lost touch with conditions in distant territories. This communication breakdown created a vicious cycle of administrative decay. Without reliable information about local conditions, royal officials could not make informed decisions about resource allocation or military deployments. Without clear direction from the centre, provincial administrators began making independent choices that often conflicted with imperial policy. Trust between different levels of government eroded as each blamed the others for the mounting problems that seemed to have no solutions. The military establishment faced its own unique challenges during this period of decline. The Khmer army had traditionally been organised around a core of professional soldiers supported by militia forces drawn from the general population. But as agricultural productivity declined and population centres emptied, it became increasingly difficult to maintain adequate force levels. Young men who might once have served in royal regiments were needed to work their families' struggling farms, or had migrated to other regions entirely. The elephant corps that had been the pride of the Khmer military proved particularly vulnerable to the changing circumstances. These massive animals required enormous quantities of food and specialized care that became increasingly expensive as resources grew scarce. Many of the mahouts who had trained for years to work with war elephants found more profitable employment in the timber industry or with foreign armies that could still afford their services. Weapons production also suffered as skilled metalworkers, and craftsmen left Angkor for more promising opportunities elsewhere. The sophisticated bronze working techniques that had produced the finest weapons and tools in Southeast Asia required not only skilled labour but also reliable supplies of raw materials that came through trade networks that were increasingly disrupted. Local commanders found themselves equipping their soldiers with inferior weapons that were no match for the better armed forces of rival kingdoms. The religious establishment underwent its own transformation during these final decades, though in ways that were often more subtle than the obvious decay affecting secular institutions. The great temples continued to function as centres of worship, but the elaborate ceremonies that had once involved hundreds of participants were scaled back to more modest affairs. The armies of priests, dancers, musicians, and servants who had once maintained the complex ritual calendar found themselves without employment as royal patronage disappeared. Many of the Hindu priests who had served the temples for generations began to adopt Buddhist practices, recognizing that the changing religious preferences of the population made such adaptation necessary for survival. This syncretism created new forms of worship that blended ancient Hindu traditions with Buddhist meditation techniques and ethical teachings. While this religious evolution helped preserve some elements of traditional culture, it also represented a fundamental break with the theological foundations that had supported the God-King system. The great libraries attached to the major temples suffered particularly devastating losses during this period. Palm leaf manuscripts that had preserved centuries of religious texts, historical chronicles, and technical knowledge were allowed to deteriorate as there were no longer sufficient resources to maintain proper storage conditions or employ scribes to make new copies. Much of the written heritage of Khmer civilization was lost forever during these decades of neglect. Educational systems that had trained generations of priests, administrators, and craftsmen also collapsed as their funding sources disappeared. The temple schools that had taught literacy and numeracy to the children of elite families were abandoned or converted to other purposes. The specialized training programs that had produced the engineers and architects responsible for Angkor's greatest achievements were discontinued as there was no longer any demand for such advanced technical skills. This breakdown in education had long-term consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The loss of literacy meant that administrative records could no longer be properly maintained, making it even more difficult for the remaining government institutions to function effectively. The disappearance of technical training programs ensured that essential maintenance skills were not passed on to younger generations, accelerating the decay of the infrastructure that still remained functional. The social fabric of Khmer society was torn apart by these multiple failures of institutional support. Traditional patterns of patronage that had connected wealthy families with craftsmen, artists, and servants broke down as the economic foundation for such relationships disappeared. Extended family networks that had provided security and mutual assistance were scattered as different members migrated to different regions in search of better opportunities. Marriage patterns also shifted dramatically during this period of upheaval. The elaborate arranged marriages that had cemented political alliances between noble families became impossible to maintain when those families could no longer guarantee their own survival, let alone their ability to honour complex matrimonial agreements. Intermarriage between different ethnic and social groups increased as traditional barriers broke down under the pressure of circumstances. The role of women in Khmer society underwent significant changes as the traditional structures that had defined their status and opportunities collapsed. Some women found new forms of independence as the breakdown of patriarchal institutions created spaces for female entrepreneurship and leadership. Others faced increased vulnerability as the protective networks provided by family and community dissolved. The famous female rulers who had occasionally governed Khmer territories became impossible as the very concept of legitimate royal authority was called into question. Cultural practices that had defined Khmer identity for centuries began to evolve rapidly under pressure from changing circumstances. Traditional festivals that had required elaborate preparation and community participation were simplified or abandoned entirely. Artistic traditions that had produced the magnificent sculptures and reliefs of the great temples were reduced to crude folk art as the sophisticated workshop systems that had trained master craftsmen disappeared. Even the Khmer language itself began to change as speakers came into increasing contact with Thai, Vietnamese, and other linguistic communities. Vocabulary related to governance, religion, and high culture was gradually replaced by loanwords from languages associated with the new centres of power in the region. While the basic structure of Khmer remained intact, the linguistic markers of the old imperial culture slowly faded from common usage. The psychological impact of witnessing the collapse of their civilization cannot be underestimated in understanding the choices made by the Khmer people during this period. Generations had grown up believing that their society represented the pinnacle of human achievement, blessed by the gods and destined for eternal prosperity. The gradual realization that these beliefs were unfounded created a profound crisis of identity that affected every aspect of social life. Some communities responded to this crisis by retreating into increasingly rigid adherence to traditional practices, as if perfect observance of ancient customs could somehow restore the old order. These groups often isolated themselves from outside influences and refused to adapt to changing circumstances, a strategy that usually hastened their decline rather than preventing it. Archaeological evidence suggests that several such communities simply disappeared entirely when their inflexible approaches proved inadequate to meet basic survival needs. Other groups embraced radical change, abandoning traditional practices entirely in favour of new religious, social, or economic systems that seemed to offer better prospects for the future. Many of these experiments in social innovation failed as well, but some succeeded in creating sustainable, new forms of community organisation that allowed their members to thrive even as the larger civilization crumbled around them. The most successful adaptation strategy appears to have been a middle path that preserved essential cultural elements while remaining flexible enough to incorporate useful innovations from other societies. Communities that followed this approach often became the ancestors of the modern Khmer people, maintaining linguistic and cultural continuity across the centuries of political fragmentation that followed Angkor's collapse. The environmental recovery of the Angkor region proceeded according to its own timeline, largely independent of human social and political developments. The massive earthworks that had created the Baray system proved remarkably durable, continuing to hold water and support aquatic ecosystems long after their original engineers had departed. Some of these artificial lakes became important wildlife habitats, supporting populations of fish, birds, and other animals that had been displaced by centuries of intensive human activity. The canal networks presented a more complex pattern of environmental change. Some channels remained functional for decades after abandonment, carrying seasonal floodwaters and supporting riparian vegetation that created new ecological corridors through the landscape. Others filled with sediment and vegetation more quickly, transforming from waterways into linear forests that provided habitat for different species entirely. The great stone temples proved to be remarkably resilient to natural forces, though they were gradually transformed by their interaction with the recovering ecosystem. Tree roots worked their way between stones, sometimes destabilizing structures, but also, paradoxically, helping to hold other elements in place. The temples became islands of stone in an expanding sea of green, creating unique microenvironments that supported specialized plant and animal communities. Some species that had been absent from the region during the height of human occupation began to return as the forest recovered. Large mammals that required extensive territories found new habitat in the abandoned agricultural areas. Bird populations exploded as the elimination of hunting pressure and the recovery of forest cover created ideal breeding conditions. The hydrological systems of the region also began to return to more natural patterns as the artificial water management infrastructure gradually failed. Seasonal flooding resumed its ancient rhythms, bringing nutrients to the soil and supporting the growth of wetland plant communities. The artificial regulation of water flow that had supported intensive agriculture was replaced by more variable, but ultimately more sustainable, natural cycles. This environmental recovery was not uniform across the entire region, however. Areas that had been most intensively modified by human activity took longer to return to natural conditions. Some locations retained visible signs of their artificial origins for centuries, creating a complex landscape that reflected layers of human and natural history. The climate patterns that had contributed to Angkor's collapse also began to stabilize by the late 15th century, though the new equilibrium was different from the conditions that had originally supported Khmer civilization. The monsoon patterns that emerged were less predictable than those of earlier centuries, but also less extreme than during the period of greatest instability. This climbability, Attic stabilization, created opportunities for new forms of human settlement, though none would match the scale and complexity of the original Angkor. Archaeological evidence from the post-abandonment period reveals that the Angkor region was never completely uninhabited, even during the decades of most dramatic decline. Small communities of farmers, fishermen, and forest dwellers continued to make their homes among the ruins, creating new patterns of settlement that were adapted to the changed circumstances. These communities often made practical use of the abandoned infrastructure, converting temple chambers into storage areas and using ancient canals as fish ponds. The persistence of these small-scale human communities helped preserve some knowledge of Angkor's history and significance, even as the great monuments were gradually engulfed by vegetation. Oral traditions maintain stories about the time when gods walked among men and great kings commanded the waters. While these stories often merged historical facts with mythological elements, they provided a cultural bridge between the ancient civilization and its modern descendants. Some of the more accessible temples continue to function as pilgrimage sites, drawing visitors from across the region who came to pay respects to the ancient deities or to seek blessings from Buddhist monks who had established small monasteries among the ruins. These religious activities helped maintain basic pathways through the jungle and prevented some structures from becoming completely overgrown. The gradual rediscovery of Angkor by the outside world began centuries before the famous French explorations of the 19th century. Chinese travellers and traders occasionally reported encountering magnificent ruins in the Cambodian jungle, though their accounts were often dismissed as exaggerated tales. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries also left scattered references to ancient temples and abandoned cities, but these reports received little attention from European audiences more focused on immediate commercial opportunities. Local knowledge of Angkor's location and significance was never communities completely lost, however. The region maintained awareness throughout of their ancestral homeland, even when political circumstances made it difficult or dangerous to visit. This cultural memory would prove crucial when later efforts were made to restore Cambodian political independence and cultural identity. The story of Angkor's collapse and abandonment thus becomes not just a tale of civilizational failure, but also one of cultural resilience and adaptation. While the great city itself was lost to the jungle, the people who had created it found ways to survive and maintain their identity under radically changed circumstances. Their success in preserving essential elements of Khmer culture through centuries of political fragmentation and foreign domination demonstrates that the true legacy of a civilization lies not in its monuments, but in the adaptability and persistence of its people. The lessons of Angkor continue to resonate with modern societies facing their own environmental and social challenges. The Khmer experience demonstrates both the remarkable achievements possible through human cooperation and ingenuity, and the vulnerabilities that can develop when complex systems become too specialized and inflexible to adapt to changing conditions. Understanding how and why this great civilization fell provides insight not only into the past, but into the choices that will determine the sustainability of our own urban centers and technological achievements. The final chapter of Angkor's story unfolds not with dramatic battles or natural disasters, but with the quiet dignity of a civilization that chose transformation over extinction. By the mid-15th century, what had once been the beating heart of Southeast Asian power had become something entirely different, yet in many ways more enduring. The massive stone faces of the Bayan temple still gazed out over empty courtyards, but they no longer watched over subjects rushing to fulfill the commands of divine kings. Instead, they observed the patient work of roots and vines, the of birds, and the occasional seasonal migrations pilgrimage of descendants who came to honor ancestors they remembered only in whispered stories. The transformation of Angkor from living city to sacred ruin created new forms of meaning that would outlast any political empire. Buddhist monks who established small monasteries among the Hindu temples were not simply occupying abandoned buildings. They were creating a bridge between the ancient world and a future that honored both continuity and change. These religious communities developed practices that blended meditation techniques brought from Sri Lanka with architectural spaces designed for Hindu cosmic ceremonies. The result was a uniquely Cambodian form of Buddhism that carried forward the spiritual aspirations of the Khmer people while adapting to their dramatically altered circumstances. The jungle that reclaimed Angkor was not the same forest that had existed before human intervention. 6 centuries of intensive cultivation, water management, and urban development had permanently altered the ecosystem. The recovering woodland was a hybrid creation, part natural regeneration and part human legacy. Ancient fruit trees planted in royal gardens now grew wild among the temples, their descendants providing food for monkeys and birds whose ancestors had known only the margins of human settlement. Ornamental plants introduced from across Asia had naturalized into the forest community, creating botanical diversity that reflected Angkor's former role as a crossroads of international trade. And so our journey through the rise and fall of Angkor comes to its end, but the echoes of this great civilization continue to whisper through the centuries. What we have witnessed is not simply the story of one city's decline, but a profound meditation on the relationship between human ambition and the natural world that sustains us. The Khmer built something magnificent, a hydraulic civilization that supported over 1 million people in one of the world's most challenging environments. Yet in their very success lay the seeds of their vulnerability. The temples still stand today, their carved faces emerging from the jungle, like ancient guardians watching over a world transformed. Visitors come from across the globe to marvel at Angkor Wat and walk the shadowed corridors of the Bayon. But perhaps the greatest monument to Khmer civilization is not carved in stone at all. It lives on in the language, traditions, and resilience of the Cambodian people, who carry forward the legacy of their ancestors, adapted and transformed by centuries of change. The story of Angkor reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations are not permanent fixtures in the landscape of history. They rise through human ingenuity and cooperation. They flourish when they find harmony with their environment, and they fade when that delicate balance is lost. Yet their true legacy lies not in the monuments they leave behind, but in the wisdom they pass on to future generations about both the possibilities and the limits of human achievement. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of one of history's greatest mysteries. Until we meet again in the shadows of the past, I wish you peaceful dreams and restful sleep.